Marcus Hayes walked down the bustling streets of the city, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the pavement. The afternoon sun bathed the tall buildings in a warm glow, casting long shadows across the crowded sidewalks. People moved around him in waves, some hurrying to catch public transport, others strolling leisurely, stopping to browse at storefronts or chat with friends. It was an ordinary day in the heart of the city, but for Marcus, every day was another step in his journey to make a difference in the world. He was a man of quiet power, his presence commanding respect without effort. Dressed sharply in a tailored dark suit, Marcus was the kind of man who moved with purpose. His crisp white shirt and silk tie added to his aura of professionalism, but there was something deeper, an air of dignity that came not from his clothes, but from his character. His calm confidence was not born out of arrogance, but from years of fighting battles in the courtroom, standing up for the voiceless and challenging injustice wherever he found it. As he walked, Marcus's eyes took in the familiar sights of the neighborhood. It was a vibrant part of town, filled with a mixture of old and new. The smell of freshly cooked street food filled the air, blending with the rich scent of coffee from the nearby cafe. Street vendors called out to passers-by, selling everything from handmade jewelry to local produce. Kids played in the park nearby, their laughter echoing through the streets. It was a scene of everyday life, a neighborhood where everyone from professionals to blue-collar workers made their way through the day. Marcus loved this place. It reminded him of where he'd come from and how far he had risen. Yet beneath the surface there was always a tension, an undercurrent of unease that people like Marcus could feel but often had to ignore. He was used to the double-edged glances, the lingering suspicion that followed him at times when he was in spaces where people felt he didn't belong. But he had learned to carry himself with poise. His calm demeanor had been his shield in many confrontations, whether subtle or overt. Marcus had grown used to proving himself in every room, even when he shouldn't have had to. This neighborhood was part of his community now, but the world hadn't always been kind to men like him, no matter how successful they were. Marcus glanced at his watch. He had just finished a meeting with some community leaders and was heading to another important event later that evening. His work as a civil rights attorney kept him busy, but it was work he embraced wholeheartedly. The cases he handled were about more than just winning in court. They were about making a real difference in the lives of people who had been mistreated, overlooked, or abused by a system stacked against them. His reputation was one of tenacity, compassion, and integrity. He never backed down from a fight, especially not when it came to injustice. And today, although he didn't know it yet, would be one of the biggest fights of his life. As he crossed the street, a police cruiser pulled up slowly alongside him. He glanced at it briefly, but thought nothing of it, just another part of the cityscape. The patrol car seemed to move on, but after Marcus reached the other side, the vehicle swung around and came to a stop a few feet ahead of him. Two officers stepped out of the car, eyeing him with cold suspicion. Marcus caught sight of them from the corner of his eye, but kept walking, his posture calm and composed. "Excuse me, sir," came a voice from behind him. Marcus slowed his pace and turned, finding himself face to face with two uniformed police officers. One of them, Officer Davis, was tall and broad-shouldered, with a stern look on his face. His partner, Officer Monroe, stood slightly behind him, his hand resting casually on his belt. Both men wore the expression Marcus had seen so many times before: skeptical, guarded, and just a little too ready for confrontation. "Yes, officer? Can I help you?" Marcus asked politely, his voice measured and steady. "We're just wondering what you're doing around here," Officer Davis said, his tone flat, but with an edge of suspicion that Marcus recognized all too well. "I'm just walking through the neighborhood," Marcus replied, keeping his voice calm and even. "Is there a problem?" Officer Monroe stepped forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You live around here?" "I do," Marcus answered without hesitation. He could feel the tension in the air rising, but he wasn't about to let it escalate. "Is there something I can assist you with?" "We need to see some ID," Officer Davis said bluntly, as though Marcus's presence alone was enough to warrant suspicion. Marcus reached calmly into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, showing no signs of agitation. He had learned over the years that staying composed in situations like this was crucial. Any sign of irritation or defiance could be interpreted as a threat, and he wasn't about to give them any reason to escalate. He handed over his driver's license, watching as Officer Davis took it with a slight smirk. As Davis studied the ID, Marcus could feel Monroe's eyes still on him, as though searching for some hidden justification for their scrutiny. It was an all too familiar scenario. Marcus had dealt with this before, being questioned for no other reason than his appearance. Despite everything he had accomplished, despite his education, his career, and his standing in the community, it never seemed to be enough to bypass the automatic suspicion that seemed to follow him. After a long pause, Officer Davis handed the ID back. "What are you doing in this part of town exactly?" "I just told you I live around here," Marcus said, keeping his tone even. "I'm on my way to a meeting." Officer Monroe folded his arms across his chest, his stance becoming more confrontational. "A meeting, huh? You got anything on you we should know about?" "No, I don't," Marcus replied, his patience being tested. He didn't like where this was going, but he remained calm. Losing his temper would only make things worse. "Mind if we take a look inside your bag?" Monroe asked, gesturing to the briefcase Marcus was carrying. "Is that necessary?" Marcus asked. "I've already given you my ID. I haven't done anything wrong." Davis stepped closer, his eyes hardening. "Look, we're just doing our job. You cooperate, and we won't have any problems." Marcus held the officer's gaze, weighing his options. He could push back and assert his rights, or he could comply and hope that this unpleasant encounter would end quickly. With the eyes of passers-by now on him and smartphones quietly being pulled out to record, Marcus made a decision. He handed over his briefcase. The officers began rifling through his things, taking their time, even though it was clear there was nothing suspicious about him or his belongings. Marcus stood still, his face impassive but his mind racing. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was yet another reminder of the systemic biases he fought against every day. He could feel the weight of all the injustices he'd seen in his work pressing down on him in this moment. After a few minutes of unnecessary searching, the officers found nothing. But instead of backing down, Officer Davis signaled to Monroe, who stepped forward with handcuffs in hand. "You're under arrest," Davis said, his voice emotionless. Marcus blinked, genuinely taken aback for the first time. "On what charge?" "We'll sort that out at the station," Monroe said with a smirk as he grabbed Marcus's wrist and snapped the cuffs on. Marcus's body remained rigid, his composure unbroken, but internally, he could feel the anger rising. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every black man who had been stopped, searched, and humiliated without cause. This was about a system that presumed guilt before innocence. As Monroe tightened the handcuffs, Marcus looked out at the crowd that had gathered. Bystanders were watching, their faces a mixture of shock, anger, and fear. Some were shouting now, their voices rising in protest. "What did he do? Why are you arresting him? This is wrong." Phones were raised, recording every second of the interaction. Marcus knew that within minutes the footage would be circulating on social media, yet another example of an all-too-common occurrence. But this time they had no idea who they were dealing with, and soon enough they were going to find out. At the station, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the cramped gray processing room. The atmosphere inside was thick with routine indifference. Officers milling about, half engaged in paperwork, suspects being shuffled in and out, and the occasional burst of radio chatter. Marcus sat silently, his hands still cuffed behind his back, his gaze focused straight ahead. His calm demeanor had not wavered, but inside he was deeply frustrated by the injustice of it all. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, arrested, humiliated, and now forced to wait as the police fumbled through their procedures, unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. Officer Davis and Officer Monroe filled out the necessary paperwork for Marcus's arrest, their attitudes still dripping with misplaced authority. They hadn't even bothered to tell him what the charges were. It was as if they were making it up as they went along, confident that no one would question their judgment. But Marcus knew better than to provoke them in that moment. He sat quietly waiting. his mind calculating the steps he would take once this ordeal was over. As Marcus waited, the door to the processing room opened and a young officer walked in, clipboard in hand. Officer Collins was new to the precinct, fresh out of the academy, and still learning the ropes. His energy was different from the other officers, a bit more hesitant, a little less hardened by the cynicism that seemed to seep into the walls of places like this. He approached the desk where Officer Monroe was standing and glanced down at the clipboard in his hands. "Who's next on the docket?" Collins asked, almost absent-mindedly. Monroe, barely looking up from his paperwork, gestured lazily toward Marcus. "That one." Caught him wandering around in a neighborhood he clearly didn't belong in. Collins furrowed his brow, flipping through the papers as he walked closer to the desk. "Name?" "Marcus Hayes," Monroe replied with a shrug, as if the name meant nothing to him. But Collins froze for a moment, his eyes widening as the name registered. He lowered the clipboard slightly and looked over at Marcus, who met his gaze with a steady, calm look. "No way," Collins muttered under his breath. Monroe noticed Collins's reaction and raised an eyebrow. "What?" Collins stepped closer to Monroe and spoke in a hushed tone. "Do you have any idea who that is?" Monroe shrugged again, looking bored. "Some guy who got mouthy thought he didn't have to follow orders. You know the type." Collins shook his head, the color draining from his face. No, you don't understand. That's Marcus Hayes. He's one of the top civil rights attorneys in the country." Monroe finally looked up, his expression shifting from indifferent to confused. "What? That guy?" "Yeah," Collins said urgently. "He's a huge deal. You've probably seen him on the news. He's worked on cases all across the country: police brutality, racial profiling, systemic corruption. He's not just some random guy off the street." Monroe blinked, suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation. His eyes flickered over to Officer Davis, who was still filling out paperwork, oblivious to the conversation. "Are you sure?" Collins nodded. "I'm positive. I saw him speak at a conference last year. He's a serious heavyweight. If you guys have wrongfully arrested him, we're in deep trouble." Monroe swallowed hard, the smirk vanishing from his face as the weight of the situation began to settle in. This was no longer just a routine arrest. If Collins was right, and he was sure he was, they had just made a colossal mistake. Monroe hurriedly walked over to Officer Davis, leaning down to whisper in his ear. "Davis," Monroe hissed, "we've got a problem. That guy we just brought in, he's Marcus Hayes." Davis furrowed his brow in confusion. "Who?" "Marcus Hayes," Monroe repeated urgently. "The civil rights lawyer. He's famous for taking on police departments over stuff like this. If this goes wrong, we're finished." Davis looked over at Marcus, who sat calmly in the corner, his expression unreadable. Panic began to creep into his chest. Suddenly, the routine arrest didn't feel so routine anymore. They hadn't just arrested some random guy. They'd arrested someone with the power to bring their entire careers crashing down. Worse yet, they hadn't even followed protocol properly. They had no legitimate reason for the arrest, and they knew it. While Davis and Monroe quietly panicked, Officer Collins hurried out of the room and made his way to Lieutenant Bradley's office, his heart pounding in his chest. He had only been at the precinct for a short time, but even he knew that this was a situation way above his pay grade. He knocked quickly on Bradley's door and entered without waiting for a reply. "Sir, we have a serious issue," Collins blurted out, barely catching his breath. Lieutenant Bradley, a grizzled officer with years of experience under his belt, looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of issue?" "It's the guy Davis and Monroe just brought in. They arrested Marcus Hayes." Bradley's eyes widened slightly. "The lawyer?" "Yes, sir, the civil rights lawyer. They didn't realize who he was." Bradley sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Marcus Hayes was not someone you wanted to cross. He had a reputation for going after police misconduct with relentless precision. This wasn't just any wrongful arrest. This was a major problem that could spiral out of control very quickly. "Bring them in," Bradley said curtly, his voice hard. Collins nodded and quickly exited the office, heading back to the processing room. When he returned, he found Monroe and Davis huddled together, whispering anxiously. They both looked up when Collins entered. "Lieutenant wants to see you now." Davis and Monroe exchanged nervous glances, but they didn't have a choice. They followed Collins down the hallway to Bradley's office, their steps heavy with apprehension. When they entered, Bradley was waiting behind his desk, his expression dark and unreadable. "Sit," Bradley said tersely, gesturing to the chairs in front of his desk. The two officers sat down, their postures stiff with tension. "You've arrested Marcus Hayes," Bradley said flatly, as if the words themselves were a judgment. "Do you have any idea what kind of situation we're in?" Davis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We didn't know it was him, sir. He was just walking through a neighborhood and we thought—" "You thought?" Bradley cut him off, his voice sharp. "You thought what? That a black man in a suit walking through a neighborhood was suspicious? Did you have any probable cause?" Monroe opened his mouth to respond, but Bradley held up a hand to stop him. "I don't want to hear excuses. You've arrested one of the most prominent civil rights lawyers in the country on no legitimate grounds, and if this blows up, we're all going down. Do you understand that?" The room fell into a heavy silence as the gravity of the situation hung in the air. Bradley leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "And if that wasn't bad enough, I just got word that Hayes is involved in a federal investigation into police corruption. He's been working undercover with federal authorities, and you just arrested him. Do you have any idea what this means?" Davis and Monroe's faces drained of color. Monroe managed to stammer, We didn't know, sir. We were just following protocol." "Protocol?" Bradley barked. "This wasn't protocol. This was stupidity, plain and simple." Bradley stood up, pacing behind his desk. The stakes had just skyrocketed. Marcus Hayes wasn't just a powerful attorney. He was part of an ongoing federal operation. This wasn't just about a wrongful arrest anymore. If they didn't handle this carefully, they could be facing a full-blown investigation, not just into this incident, but into the entire department. "We need to fix this," Bradley said finally, his tone resolute. "And fast. Release him immediately." "But sir, what if—" Monroe started to say, but Bradley cut him off. "I don't care what you think. If you don't want your badge on the line, you'll do exactly as I say. Release him and prepare for the fallout." As Davis and Monroe left the office to carry out the order, the weight of their actions hung heavily over them. They knew they had crossed a line, and now it was too late to undo the damage. The only thing they could do was try to contain the fallout. But deep down, they knew the storm was coming, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Meanwhile, outside the station, the crowd had grown significantly. What had started as a small group of onlookers had swelled into a full-blown protest. People held signs demanding justice, and chants filled the air, echoing down the streets as more and more people gathered. News cameras had arrived, capturing the growing unrest, and social media had already exploded with footage of Marcus's arrest. The situation was spiraling out of control faster than the police had anticipated. Inside, Marcus remained calm, though he could hear the commotion outside. He knew the public was behind him, and he knew that his position gave him leverage. But even as he sat quietly, waiting for the next move, he was already planning his response. This wasn't just about his own wrongful arrest. This was about a broken system that had repeatedly failed the people it was supposed to protect. Lieutenant Bradley was pacing the station's main office, watching the protest through the window, the chants growing louder. He knew the release of Marcus wouldn't be enough to quell the anger. The damage had been done, and the department's reputation was now hanging by a thread. As Chief Mitchell entered the room, his face was grim, fully aware of the gravity of the situation. "We need to issue a public apology," Bradley said without preamble. Mitchell's jaw clenched. "Do we have to? If we don't, this will explode. We're already under scrutiny. Hayes has connections at the federal level, and if we don't handle this right, we could be facing more than just public backlash. We're talking about a full-blown federal investigation." Mitchell rubbed his temples, feeling the pressure building. "Fine, prepare a statement, but I'm not happy about this." Bradley nodded grimly. "Neither am I, but it's the only way." The station scrambled to prepare for the release of Marcus, but outside the crowd continued to swell, their voices growing louder, more insistent. They weren't just demanding his release, they were demanding accountability. And once Marcus walked out of that station, the fight for justice would only begin in earnest. As the heavy metal door of the police station creaked open, the noise of the protesting crowd outside hit Marcus Hayes like a tidal wave. The cool night air rushed in, bringing with it the chants of hundreds of voices calling for justice. The street, once bustling with normal city life, had transformed into a sea of people. Protesters held signs high above their heads, their faces resolute, united by a shared sense of outrage at the injustice they had witnessed earlier that day. "Let him go! Justice for Marcus! No more police abuse!" Marcus stepped out, still wearing the same dignified suit he had worn when the officers had stopped him earlier. But now his clothes were slightly wrinkled, a sign of the hours of wrongful detention he had endured. Yet despite everything, his composure was unwavering. His eyes scanned the crowd, and for the first time since his arrest, a small flicker of emotion broke through his calm exterior. Gratitude. These people, many of whom didn't know him personally, had stood outside, demanding his release, their voices amplifying his own unspoken resistance. For a moment, the crowd fell silent as they realized Marcus had emerged. It was as though time itself had paused, everyone waiting to see what he would do next. But Marcus was no ordinary man. He was a fighter, a voice for the voiceless. And now, as he stood before them, he knew this was his moment to speak, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever suffered at the hands of injustice. A community leader who had been helping organize the protest stepped forward and handed Marcus a megaphone. She looked at him with a mixture of respect and hope. "We've been waiting for you," she said softly. "They need to hear from you." Marcus nodded, gripping the megaphone in one hand, and took a deep breath. He knew that what he said now would matter, not just to the people standing in front of him, but to the countless others who would see this moment unfold on social media, on the news, and in their own communities. The weight of the moment was heavy, but Marcus had carried heavier burdens before. The crowd, sensing that Marcus was about to speak, grew quiet once more. Phones were raised, cameras rolling, capturing every second of what was about to unfold. The flickering streetlights above cast long shadows across the street, but Marcus's presence seemed to brighten the darkness. He stepped forward, his voice steady but powerful. "Thank you," he began, his voice amplified through the megaphone, resonating over the crowd. "Thank you for standing here today, for standing up, for refusing to be silent in the face of injustice. What happened today wasn't just about me. It wasn't just one man being wrongfully arrested. It was about something much larger, a system that has failed our communities for too long." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces attentive, hanging on to every word. "I was stopped today for walking through a neighborhood I call home," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. "I was questioned, searched, and arrested for no reason other than the fact that I didn't fit someone's idea of who should be here. But the truth is, this happens every day. Every single day. To black men, to black women, to our brothers and sisters of color. Today it was me. Tomorrow it could be someone else." He paused, looking out over the crowd, his eyes catching the faces of young people, older generations, families, and activists, all of them united in their desire for change. "We can't keep letting this happen. We can't keep letting a broken system control our lives, our communities, our futures." The crowd erupted in applause, cheers of agreement rippling through the sea of people. Marcus raised a hand, signaling for quiet once again. He wasn't finished. "The system is built on the idea that some people matter more than others," he said, his voice cutting through the night air with conviction. "But we're here to say enough is enough. We're here to say that we all matter, that our rights, our dignity, our freedom matter just as much as anyone else's." A woman in the crowd called out, "We're with you, Marcus." Marcus smiled briefly, his heart swelling with both pride and determination. "I know," he replied, meeting her gaze, "and that's why we need to keep fighting. This doesn't end tonight. This is only the beginning. The truth is, there's a lot of work to be done. Real change doesn't come from one protest or one speech. It comes from consistent, relentless action. He let those words hang in the air for a moment, giving them time to sink in. The crowd was quiet now, listening intently, their energy focused on his every word. In the days ahead, I will be working with community leaders, with activists, and with all of you to push for that change. We're going to demand accountability. We're going to push for reform, and we're not going to stop until we see real, tangible results. We need to change how our police forces operate. We need to hold them accountable for their actions. We need to reform the way our legal system treats Black and brown communities. The crowd responded with a renewed wave of applause and chants of "No justice, no peace." And it's not just about protests, Marcus continued, his voice steady but impassioned. We need to push for legal action. We need to create legal aid clinics, training programs, and educational initiatives. We need to empower our communities, educate them about their rights, and give them the tools to fight back. This isn't just about holding the police accountable. It's about dismantling a system that's been designed to oppress us. He paused again, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. He could see the determination in their faces, the hunger for justice, the need for real change. "And we will do it," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Together we will do it. We will create a system that works for everyone, not just for the privileged few. We will demand better. We will fight for better, and we will not stop until we have it." The crowd erupted once more, their voices rising in a unified chorus of support. Marcus felt a swell of emotion wash over him. This wasn't just a speech, it was a movement, and it was just the beginning. As the cheers died down, Marcus raised the megaphone once again. "But tonight I want you to remember something important," he said, his voice softening slightly. "This fight isn't just about one man or one event. It's about all of us. It's about the future we want to build for our children, for the next generation. We can't afford to be complacent. We can't afford to give up. Change is possible, but it's up to us to make it happen." The crowd was silent, listening to his final words with rapt attention. "So when you go home tonight, don't forget this moment. Don't forget what we're fighting for. Don't forget that we have the power to make a difference. And don't stop fighting, because the road ahead is long and there will be obstacles, but together we are unstoppable." With that, Marcus lowered the megaphone and looked out over the sea of faces, each one reflecting the same resolve, the same hope, the same determination. They had all come here to demand justice, and now, with Marcus leading the charge, they were ready to fight for it. The crowd erupted into applause once more, and chants of "Marcus, Marcus" filled the air. He smiled, humbled by their support, and raised his hand in a gesture of gratitude. As he stepped down from the makeshift platform, people rushed forward to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him how much his words had meant to them. Marcus greeted them all with warmth, but in his mind, he was already thinking about the next steps. The real work was just beginning. Behind him, the police station loomed, a stark reminder of the battle he had just fought and the many battles still to come. But tonight, as he looked out over the crowd and saw the hope in their eyes, Marcus knew one thing for certain. They were on the right path. And with enough determination, with enough unity, they would win. As the night wore on, the protest began to disperse, but the energy remained, crackling in the air like static electricity. People left with a renewed sense of purpose, talking among themselves about what they could do next, how they could contribute, how they could keep the momentum going. Marcus stayed behind for a few moments longer, watching the last of the protesters filter out into the night. He knew the days ahead would be difficult. He knew the system would push back, resist the change he and so many others were demanding. But he was ready. He had always been ready. The fight for justice was never easy, but Marcus Hayes had never been one to shy away from a fight. The days after the legislation passed marked the beginning of a new phase in the movement that Marcus Hayes had helped ignite. Though the reforms were significant, a victory that no one could deny, they were just the first step in what Marcus knew would be a long, difficult road. The city had committed to change, but Marcus was well aware that legislation alone couldn't transform a system that had been built on decades of inequality, corruption, and injustice. The police department was now under federal oversight, a move that had been met with a mixture of relief from the community and staunch resistance from within the department itself. Officers, especially those connected to the union, bristled at the new rules and restrictions, seeing them as attacks on their autonomy. Tensions within the department were high, with some officers openly defying the new mandates or dragging their feet in implementing them. For Marcus, this was a critical time. He had seen reform efforts stall before, sabotaged by those who refused to change. But this time, he wasn't going to let that happen. He knew that to ensure these reforms took root, they needed more than just words on paper. They needed practical, sustained efforts, actions that would make sure the policies were enforced and that the culture within the police department began to shift. That's why Marcus, along with other community leaders and civil rights advocates, launched a series of community-based initiatives to support the implementation of the new reforms. The first of these was a community oversight board made up of local leaders, activists, and citizens who had experienced or witnessed police misconduct firsthand. The board would meet regularly with city officials and police leadership to monitor the progress of the reforms and, more importantly, hold them accountable. Marcus attended the first meeting of the Oversight Board, sitting among the citizens who had come together to make sure the changes they had fought for were not just promises, but realities. The board members were a diverse group, young and old, men and women, people of all races and backgrounds. Some were longtime activists, seasoned in the fight for justice, while others were new to the movement, compelled by what they had seen in the streets and on their screens. As the meeting began, Marcus could feel a sense of purpose in the room, an unspoken understanding that they were at the forefront of something historic. The members of the Oversight Board began to discuss their role, their mission, and their plans for how they would engage with the police department moving forward. "We can't just be a rubber stamp," said Gloria, the seasoned community activist who had stood beside Marcus throughout the protests. Her voice was firm, her eyes sharp with determination. "We need to be the watchdogs, the ones who make sure every promise they made is kept." There was a chorus of agreement from the others around the table. Marcus listened, nodding thoughtfully. He had fought many battles in the courtroom, but this was something different. This was about building a framework that would outlast any single case or protest, something that would ensure that the momentum they had built wouldn't be lost. Another important piece of the puzzle was the police training program that Marcus had championed from the start. With the passage of the new reforms, every officer in the department was now required to undergo extensive training in de-escalation tactics, cultural sensitivity, and racial bias. This training wasn't just a box to check. It was designed to fundamentally change how officers approach their work, especially in marginalized communities. Marcus worked closely with experts in the field, psychologists, social workers, and legal scholars, to develop a comprehensive curriculum that would challenge the deeply ingrained biases that had plagued the department for years. The training was not without its critics. Many officers, especially the old guard, resisted it, complaining that it was unnecessary or that it made their jobs more difficult. But Marcus knew that changing a system meant pushing against the resistance. He knew that the more entrenched the opposition, the more necessary the change. To ensure the training was effective, Marcus insisted that community members, people who had been directly impacted by police misconduct, be brought in to share their experiences with the officers. He believed that real change could only come when those in power were forced to confront the human cost of their actions. These sessions were often tense, with some officers visibly uncomfortable as they listened to stories of harassment, brutality, and racial profiling. But Marcus believed in the power of those stories to break through the barriers of denial and defensiveness. As time went on, the effects of the reforms began to take shape. The body camera policy, which had been one of the most contentious points of the legislation, was now fully in place. Every officer was required to wear a body camera while on duty, and the footage was regularly reviewed by the Oversight Board. This transparency was a game changer, giving the community a new level of insight into police interactions and holding officers accountable in ways that had never been possible before. The reforms were working, but Marcus knew that change wouldn't come overnight. It would take time, years even, for the full impact of the reforms to be felt. But he remained committed, knowing that every small victory was a step towards something larger, something more enduring. At the same time, Marcus was working with local officials to establish legal aid clinics in underserved communities. These clinics were designed to provide free legal services to those who couldn't afford representation, giving them the tools to fight back against injustice. Marcus had seen too many people caught in the system, unable to defend themselves against charges they couldn't fight simply because they didn't have the resources. These clinics were a lifeline for people like that, ensuring that the legal system wasn't just a tool for the wealthy and powerful, but a resource for everyone. The educational initiatives were another key part of Marcus's plan. He worked with local schools and community organizations to develop programs that taught young people about their rights, the law, and the importance of civic engagement. He believed that real change wouldn't just come from the top down, but from the bottom up. If young people were empowered with knowledge, they could be the ones to lead the next generation of activists, lawyers, and community leaders. It wasn't easy. The road ahead was still long, and Marcus knew that there would be setbacks along the way. But every step forward was progress, and Marcus refused to be discouraged. The movement had gained strength, and with it a sense of hope that had been absent for too long. One evening, after a long day of meetings and planning sessions, Marcus sat in his office reflecting on everything that had happened since his arrest. He thought about the protests, the speeches, the meetings with city officials, and the countless hours spent drafting legislation and organizing initiatives. It had been exhausting work, but it was work that mattered. And as he sat there, a sense of pride washed over him. Not pride in himself, but in the community that had risen up alongside him. They had fought together, and they had won together. He thought about the faces he had seen at the protests, the young people, the elders, the families who had stood in the streets demanding justice. He thought about the members of the oversight board, the volunteers at the legal clinics, the teachers leading the educational initiatives. This was what progress looked like, not a single dramatic victory, but 1,000 small actions taken by people who refused to give up. As he looked out the window, the city stretching out before him, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The fight wasn't over, and it wouldn't be over for a long time. But he knew, deep in his heart, that they were moving in the right direction. Change was happening, and it was happening because people had come together, united in their demand for a better, more just world. Marcus smiled to himself as he gathered his things, ready to head home. He knew that tomorrow would bring more challenges, more meetings, more battles to fight. But for tonight, he allowed himself to rest, knowing that the foundation for something greater had been laid. As he walked out of his office and into the cool night air, Marcus Hayes felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. But it was a weight he had carried for years, and he was prepared to carry it for many more. The city was quiet now, the streets mostly empty, but Marcus knew that in homes and community centers all across the city, the work was continuing. The movement was alive, fueled by the people who had decided that enough was enough. And as Marcus walked into the night, he knew that this was only the beginning. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt hopeful. Real change was possible, and together, they would make it happen. The fight for justice was far from over, but with every step they took, they were moving closer to the world they all deserved. And Marcus Hayes, the man who had stood at the center of it all, was ready for whatever came next.